welcome. You're watching Middle East Now on I24 News. The top stories this hour. All right, we're having a little problem with our headlines there. Let me tell you what they are then and what we will be covering in the show this hour. First of all, did Israeli special forces manage to break in to an underground Iranian weapons facility in Syria, remove the equipment and then destroy it? We'll have the details on that. Plus, the United States has restored a full $1.3 billion aid payment to Egypt, despite Cairo's lack of progress on human rights. And we'll talk about the biggest evacuation of civilians out of Gaza since the war began. The World Health Organization has helped transfer them over to the United Arab Emirates. All of that coming up in the programme. But first, Israeli ground forces broke into an Iranian weapons facility in Syria, removed equipment and then destroyed the site. That's according to multiple reports. The daring raid said to have happened early Monday when Syrian media reported several unusual airstrikes across multiple cities in Syria. The official response from Israel today, no comments. Our Middle East correspondent Aaron Osseran has the story.
What was initially believed to be an unusual series of Israeli airstrikes in Syria early Monday turns out to be closer to the plot of a Hollywood action movie.
كشفت مصادر خاصة لتلفزيون سوريا تفاصيل الضربات التي نفذتها إسرائيل على منطقة مصياف قبل يومين، حيث نفذت القوات الإسرائيلية عملية إنزال جوي على مركز البحوث العلمية في مصياف. تمكنت خلالها تل أبيب من اختطاف إيرانيين اثنين.
Syrian opposition TV and a Greek researcher separately reported that the dramatic raid, which lasted an hour, began with a series of airstrikes on the research center, the surrounding roads, and military facilities. Then, Israeli commando forces were airdropped into an IRGC military facility for developing ballistic missiles and drones, withdrawing with important equipment and documents, including the reported capture of 2 to 4 Iranian officers. The forces then laid charges and exploded the site, destroying it completely, before pulling out under heavy air support. Both Syria and Iran denied the reports.
This aggression came in waves. It was a brutal and savage aggression. Till now, we have 18 killed and 37 injured. The injuries vary from critical to light. The health sector in Hama is doing its best by providing necessary aid to the injured.
Meanwhile, an Israeli drone eliminated a Hezbollah operative in the Quneitra countryside in southwest Syria, the IDF said, further illustrating how Syria has become a support front for Iran's Lebanese proxy. Throughout the day, Hezbollah launched over a dozen rockets and numerous drones at northern Israel's western Galilee, causing no injuries but sparking fires in the area. The IDF said it struck a Hezbollah site and rocket launcher in southern Lebanon. With tensions between the sides running high, the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, visited the volatile border and called on Lebanese diplomats to silence the drums of war.
We need to de-escalate military tensions and use this opportunity to urge all sides to pursue this path.
Borrell called for an immediate implementation of the 2006 UN resolution aimed at preventing hostilities.
I avail myself of this opportunity to reiterate Lebanon's commitment to the comprehensive and balanced implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701.
Stay tuned, but don't hold your breath.
All right, we'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's go to the north of Israel. Our correspondent, Zach Anders, is standing by. And Zach, this remarkable mission, if it indeed happened at all, is being seen as part of Israel's efforts to switch its focus to the north and the fight with Iranian proxies in the north, in Syria and, of course, in Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly look at it this way. I think the undercurrent that I'm hearing at this point now is more or less that the IDF is trying to handicap Hezbollah in certain ways and means, obviously striking production facilities. Within the last month, we've seen a heavy emphasis on hitting some of these storage depots where the weapons are secondary explosions. They're cooking off after the Israeli airstrike, trying to go at the heart of this rocket production and drone production ability, though, of course, again, it kind of seems like, and to some of the folks that I'm speaking to, it seems like nibbling around the issue not directly going head-on with Hezbollah, but trying to, again, see what you can get away with and take away their ability to manufacture, produce some of these weapons and hit them in other means. What we're tracking at this hour, 9 attacks. Hezbollah has claimed responsibility. We're here in Kiryat Shmona watching and waiting because there has been an additional targeting, what appears to be an airstrike on a vehicle in the Nabatea area, which is about 70 miles north of this border. It used to be at the beginning of this conflict when we were talking about, wow, there's been an airstrike in Nabatea, how deep inside Lebanon that is. Well, that amazement at that fact has dissipated now. It's become more and more common to see these strikes deep inside Lebanese territory, and it's not remarkable at all in the last few months to see this kind of activity. But what we're waiting for is, after strikes such as these, it's not uncommon to see Hezbollah launch a rather large rocket attack or any sort of response, really, after strikes like these. We don't know who was targeted. We just know that a vehicle appears to be on the receiving end of what looks like airstrike damage. Vehicle veered off to the side of the road, and what looks like an impact site in the road itself, and fires burning alongside the roadways. So we'll keep a close eye on this, and of course we'll keep an eye on the skies here in northern Israel, considering we might be seeing some sort of response from Hezbollah at some point in the night. They've already claimed responsibility for, again, 9 attacks at this point. We have seen fires started as a result of these earlier attacks, but no casualties reported, and we don't have any reports of damage to homes or businesses. But then again, whether or not these have inflicted any damage at any IDF sites, of course, we won't know for certain, as the damage or the impacts to any IDF sites has not been reported throughout the course of this conflict.
Zach, thank you very much. Zach Andrews there up in the north of Israel. Well, with me in the studio this hour, our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osseran and Asher Fredman, Senior Fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security and the Director for Israel at the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. Welcome to you both. Ariel, just briefly then, because we have had some more news in the last hour or so, with the IDF saying it's carried out 2 drone strikes in the south of Syria.
Yeah, so it confirmed the strike in Quneitra and in another area in southern Syria, confirming the elimination of a Hezbollah combatant. But really, in the last moments, what we're seeing images now coming out from southern Lebanon of this airstrike in Nabatea area that was just mentioned. Now, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry, 1 person was killed in a drone strike on a motorcycle in that area. Now, Nabatea is considered to be perhaps the center of gravity for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. That's where they have their main command centers. That's where the commander of Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon, that's where he sits. That's where their main facilities are. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that this specific elimination was of a substantially high-ranking officer, because we have seen such targeted eliminations on pretty much a daily basis, and this isn't the first today. But as Zach described, this would be further going in deeper and deeper in southern Lebanon as Israel tries to continue to target Hezbollah officials.
Taking the fight to their doorstep, while the north, of course, remains largely evacuated. Asher, let's talk about this, or about reports of this operation inside Syria. Israeli special forces going into an underground weapons production facility owned by Iran, destroying it. Those are the reports that we're getting. Of course, we're not going to get any confirmation of that. But if it is confirmed, this would be a stunning example of Israeli intelligence, and also how Israel is slowly restoring its deterrence in the region.
This would be an incredible example of a successful Israeli operation. We have to remember that Iran still has an open account with Israel, and we may still see Iranian attempts to take retribution, both for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and other Israeli strikes against Iranian targets. We have to remember also that Syria has extensive cooperation with Iran, with Hezbollah, also with China, with North Korea. We've seen this kind of military cooperation before. I still think, as we just heard the report before, that we're still at this tit-for-tat game in the north where Israel strikes, Hezbollah strikes. But if and when Israel is going to have to execute a wider operation, it's going to have to take out as many of strategic assets of Iran and of Hezbollah as possible, and this may be a first step towards doing that.
All right. OK, thank you both. Well, the IDF, meanwhile, has named 9 Hamas operatives who were killed in a strike on a former school in Nuseirat in Gaza today. 3 of the 9 worked for the UN aid agency UNRWA. The IDF says it was targeting a Hamas command centre. Our correspondent Robert Swift has this report.
18 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike on a school in the central Gaza Strip, according to the Hamas-run Civil Defense Agency. Among the dead are 6 UNRWA staffers. The UN's chief, Antonio Guterres, announced on X.
We have witnessed a series of military interventions by Israel in Gaza with a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in my time as Secretary General, and with very dramatic violations of international humanitarian law and total absence of an effective protection of civilians.
The attack is the single largest loss of life for the relief agency since the start of the 11-month conflict, with more than 200 staffers killed to date. The school in Nuseirat was sheltering some 12,000 displaced Gazans and has been previously struck from the air on 4 other occasions. Israel has long accused UNRWA of being infiltrated by Hamas.
But when you speak about UNRWA, they are not focused on supporting the Palestinians. They focus on incitement and advocacy against Israel. And every time we saw the collaboration with Hamas.
The organization was using the school as a command and control center, an Israeli military spokesperson said, noting that precision weaponry, aerial imagery and additional intelligence were utilized to mitigate against the risk of civilian casualties. Hamas frequently screens its assets behind Gazan civilians, including in areas the IDF has declared as humanitarian zones. Israeli attacks against such locations have appeared to increase in recent months as Hamas has lost ground, with Gazan civilians and aid workers carrying the cost.
So, Asher Fredman, we see this scenario all the time, don't we? The IDF carries out an airstrike on a target inside Gaza. Hamas claims large-scale humanitarian civilian casualties. Then we get world leaders condemning Israel, and then we get a correction, a muted correction later in the day. The IDF is saying today that 9 Hamas operatives were targeted in this strike. 3 of them worked for UNRWA. This is what we see kind of rinse and repeat again and again, isn't it?
First of all, it's incredible that 11 months after the start of the war, we're still seeing, Hamas puts out numbers, they're immediately parroted around the world, and an hour later, 2 hours later, 5 hours later, we see the truth, and still the lie gets all the way around the world. Hamas is so deeply and thoroughly infiltrated UNRWA in Gaza, whether it's their facilities and their installations and their salaries and their money and their staff. We should be surprised when Israel hits a Hamas terrorist and he's not also an UNRWA employee, not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. And Aaron, at the same time, we're hearing from the IDF, they are claiming today that Hamas's Rafah brigade has been defeated and that there are no more active cross-border tunnels, which is significant, isn't it?
This is significant, and I think that is one of the first claims by the IDF that the Egyptians will be relieved to hear, because since the Operation Rafah began and Israel began destroying numerous cross-border underground tunnels, the Egyptians constantly denied the existence of even a single one. So now that the IDF is no longer dismantling them, it doesn't have to cause more tensions with Egypt. But if we're talking about the dismantling of the battalions, IDF saying it killed over 2,000 terrorists and destroyed approximately 13 kilometers of underground tunnels. This comes as the IDF and also Israel's political leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and also Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, are continuously saying that Hamas's military apparatus has been destroyed. Its battalions are no longer active. But that doesn't mean that they don't have fighting capabilities, that they don't have fighters. So only in northern Gaza, Hamas is believed to have recruited between 3,000 and 4,000 new fighters to fill in the gaps, fill in the ranks of those who were eliminated. So when the IDF says that it eliminates a brigade, what it means is that the structural brigade, like the standing military form, that no longer exists. But that doesn't mean that there are no longer Hamas fighters in the area, and that no longer means that Israeli forces operating are no longer.
Asha, this was the famous 4 last brigades of Hamas, and that was the reason that the IDF had to go into Rafah. So it is significant, is it not, if they're saying that they have been defeated?
Hamas is built to work both in a brigade battalion formation and also as terrorists, as guerrillas, as small cells. And for them, it's not an issue. Okay, we can know now, right now, we can operate like a brigade. We'll take a step back. We will return to our guerrilla, to our terrorist cell. And as soon as the IDF pulls out, they'll be able to reconstitute. The number that's important is how many Hamas fighters have been neutralized, how many of these tunnels have been stopped so that new weapons cannot be brought in, and how much of the weaponry that exists in the workshops and the labs have been destroyed. The question of whether they're operating now as a battalion or as cells is much less important.
Okay, thank you both. Well, Egypt says it is in favour of an international Arab peacekeeping force along the Philadelphia corridor in the south of the Gaza Strip. That's according to a report in Al Arabi Al Jadid. The UAE has reportedly already been in contact with Morocco, Mauritania and Djibouti about their possible participation. At the same time, the Biden administration has just granted Egypt the full $1.3 billion in military aid. Our Fabio Shapiro has more on that.
The Biden administration will grant $1.3 billion for military aid to Egypt. The State Department informed Congress of its decision not to withhold any of the amount granted annually to the Arab country. In previous years, Washington has retained part of the grant as penalty for the human rights violations, which include cases of torture, illegal killings, jailing of dissidents, electoral suppression, and more. Out of the $1.3 billion, $320 million is usually withheld until pre-established conditions are met.
This decision is important to advancing regional peace and Egypt's specific and ongoing contributions to U.S. national security priorities, particularly to finalize a ceasefire agreement for Gaza, bring the hostages home, surge humanitarian assistance for Palestinians in need, and help bring an enduring end to the Israel-Hamas conflict. We've reiterated with partners in Egypt that more action is needed and expected to build on this trajectory to further strengthen our relationship.
The decision received backlash from many progressive think tanks and politicians, including the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chris Murphy.
It's no secret that Egypt remains a deeply repressive autocratic state, and I see no good reason to ignore that fact by waiving these requirements.
With Egypt playing a significant role in the region, the United States seems to believe it is not the time to create animosity with Cairo. The country is a key player in negotiations in the Sudanese civil war and in the conflict between Hamas and Israel. It acted as a middle ground during the latest hostage deal last year. And despite reports on facilitating smuggling through the Philadelphia corridor, it has worked closely with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority.
From our side, here in Egypt, we are always keen to have a positive role, whether with the Palestinians, Hamas in particular, in cooperation with the Qataris and the United States. But Europe has a great weight. And it's very important during this critical phase to apply additional pressure in order to be able to reach an agreement that achieves stability and lightens the struggle of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Egypt has been busy with diplomatic efforts in the past week. An Egyptian delegation was in Washington for a U.S.-Egypt Joint Economic Commission session, and President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi received German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier and European Council Vice President Joseph Borrell.
Mentioning the dramatic situation in this region, where the confluence of crises poses a direct threat on both Egypt and the European Union security. No solution can work without full engagement and support by Egypt.
Earlier this year, Egypt officially joined the BRICS bloc, aligning itself with China and Russia. Washington's decision to grant Egypt the full aid amount unconditionally may be an attempt to counter that.
For more, we're joined by Mariam Wahba, analyst at the FDD, the Foundation for the Defence of Democracy. It's good to see you, Mariam. Thank you very much for joining us. And leaving aside the overriding human rights concerns in Egypt, couldn't the Biden administration have used this money as some kind of leverage over Egypt when it comes to Gaza? Cairo hasn't allowed any refugees. It has actively covered up the tunnels that we know go from Gaza into its territory, allowing Hamas to rearm. I mean, do you think the Americans missed a trick here?
Good to be with you today, Laura. Absolutely, you are spot on when it comes to this. I'll remind viewers that these were conditions set by the Biden White House. The U.S. was withholding $325 million in U.S. aid to Egypt so that it can proceed and make progress on these human rights concerns. Now, the White House has said that this decision came in light of how Egypt has been helping in Gaza. There's been little to no transparency on how Egypt exactly has been helping with Gaza. As we've seen when it comes to the Philadelphia corridor, Egypt has actually sided with Hamas. So all to say, there's some troubling concerns here with what are exactly the motivations with proceeding with this aid to Egypt.
And Mariam, what does Egypt plan to do with this very large slice of aid money from the United States? I know you've written about how the Egyptians are planning to send troops to Somalia, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. So it looks like this money from the U.S. is earmarked for military development for the Egyptians, which is where a lot of U.S. aid money goes to. We know that Egypt is reportedly one of the largest armies in the region. And we know that since Camp David back in '79, Egypt has received more than 50 billion, yes, that's right, billion with a B, in U.S. aid and another 30 billion in military aid. And there's another lack of transparency here with how exactly Egypt spends that money.
And finally, what about these reports and that Egypt is willing to allow some kind of international peacekeeping force to patrol the Philadelphia corridor? Would that work?
So while this may seem like it's a step in the right direction, I have some doubts. There has been very little success with the idea or the notion of international forces, and these international forces would be made up of members of Arab militaries. Now, whether that idea can come to fruition and the Arab countries can agree on how many and what exactly to send to these corridors is one question. The second and most important question is there a will to actually enforce some law and order using this international troops?
Mariam, we appreciate it. Thank you very much. Mariam Waba there at the FTD.
Thank you.
Asha Fredman is with us in the studio. When it comes to Egypt, do you think the Americans are really getting much bang for their buck? Are they getting good value for money?
We have to look at the context. Egypt is suffering economically, also because of the Houthi attacks impacting the trade in the Suez Canal. Hundreds of thousands of refugees from Sudan, which they did let in, as opposed to the refugees from Gaza. There's also been reports that Egypt is looking at purchasing advanced weapons from China. And the Egyptian army has been growing at a very accelerated pace. Those also went into the U.S. considerations in terms of how much they want to support Egypt. But I would definitely hope that the U.S. told the Egyptians that they expect much better performance, both on the cross-border tunnels and at the Rafah crossing. The Egyptian denials, I mean, those missiles came from somewhere. Those rockets came from somewhere. Those armies, they didn't just appear, and they weren't smuggled. There were things smuggled in from Israel, but not anti-tank missiles. These came from the Sinai Desert.
Okay, and real quick, Ariel.
Yeah, I think introducing more countries, more stakeholders to the safety and quiet across the Philadelphia border corridor is in everyone's interest. But the danger is below the corridor and, as Asha said, in the Rafah crossing. The presence of international forces will not prevent underground tunnels. And as far as the security checks in the Rafah border crossing, that is going to be up to the Egyptians even after this. And so diplomatically, Israel needs to continue to work with Egypt to increase their accountability regarding what goes on their main border crossing.
Right, we don't want a repeat of international forces in Lebanon, do we? All right, thank you both for now. Well, in Israel's multi-fronted war, most of the attention has been on either the north or the south. But in the last month, Israel has stepped up a lot of its efforts onto the West Bank, conducting the largest counter-terror operations in years. Our Joe Brown reports.
The largest counter-terror operation in a generation. Israel is striking the West Bank hard, whilst receiving tragic reminders as to why they are doing this. Late on Wednesday night, the IDF confirmed it was striking in Tulkarem in the northwest of the West Bank, a city the IDF has focused a lot of its recent operations in. According to reports on the ground, 3 people were killed after a vehicle was struck. This comes a day after an IDF strike in Tubas in northeast of the West Bank killed 5. And in between these strikes, another terror attack, as an oil tanker driven by a West Bank resident rammed into a bus stop in Givat Asaf near Ramallah, killing IDF soldier Geri Gideon Hankal.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sent his condolences to Hankal's family whilst on a visit to the Israel-Jordan border, where he vowed to stop the smuggling of weapons from Jordan into the West Bank.
In this multi-front struggle, we know that we need to secure our eastern border with Jordan. This is a border of peace. We are partnering with the Kingdom of Jordan to ensure that it remains so. But in recent days, the challenges have grown. There is an attempt to smuggle both terrorists and weapons across Jordan into Judea and Samaria and into the cities of Israel.
And another front that Netanyahu has to worry about is the international arena. Amid mounting criticism of Israel from its allies as the war in Gaza progresses, tensions with the US were exacerbated by the killing of Aysenur Agi, a Turkish-born American peace activist who was killed during a protest against the IDF near Nablus last week. Whilst the IDF has said that she was, quote, likely killed by the IDF, a new report from the Washington Post has added a new layer to the story. According to reports, Agi was shot by the IDF 20 minutes after clashes amongst protesters dispersed, and around 200 meters away from the site, suggesting that it was intentional. The IDF says that the incident is under investigation.
I want justice for Aysenur and I want justice for her family, and so I hope that the administration and the U.S. government will launch an independent investigation.
Last Saturday, the IDF officially wrapped up its 10-day raid on refugee camps in the West Bank. But the fight against terror cells in the region is not slowing down anytime soon.
And Asha, real quick, the West Bank extremely volatile and has been for many months.
We are likely to see more large-scale attempted suicide attacks, even kidnapping attacks. The IDF will have to expand its intensive operations from the north to the south, and certainly Israel will need to do much more to secure the border with Jordan, which right now is very open.
Okay, and we will be talking about Jordan after the break. We've got election results there. The Islamists came out on top. We'll also be talking about the biggest evacuation of Gazan civilians since the war began. They've gone to the UAE. More on that next.
Sail for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad. With renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayasad.fr.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back. It is the biggest evacuation of Gazan civilians since the war began. The IDF has been working with the World Health Organization to get nearly 100 people, including many children, out of Gaza and to the United Arab Emirates for medical treatment. Here's an official from the WHO speaking earlier.
Patients included 45 children and 52 adults with a range of diseases. I'll not go in the numbers, but ranging from blood diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, congenital anomalies, ear conditions, endocrine diseases, eye conditions, immunological disorders, liver disease, renal disease, skin conditions, and of course, trauma, a lot of trauma. Gaza need medical corridors. We need a better organized and a sustained system, not per se an ad hoc approach. We need a medical corridor to be restored, the traditional referral pathway from Gaza to East Jerusalem and West Bank to be restored as soon as possible. We need a referral pathway into Egypt and perhaps Jordan, and of course other countries which are ready to receive Gazan patients. We still estimate that more than 10,000 Gazans need to be medical evacuators. Half of them probably the war-related, trauma-related injuries, and the other half the chronic patients.
And we can go to Dubai now. Our correspondent Bastien Borghi is standing by. Sebastian, tell us, how was this evacuation made possible in the first place?
Well, they were evacuated by road and then by air from Israel's Ramon airport in the very south of the country, next to Eilat, directly to Abu Dhabi. And this is the result of several months of delayed negotiations between the Emirati and Israeli authorities, as well as international organizations, including the World Health Organization, which actually has large warehouses here on the outskirts of Dubai. And the official communique states that the president of the UAE has and had directed the provision of all kinds of medical care for these Gazans until they recover and return to the Gaza Strip. And countries like Egypt and Qatar were also involved in these talks, as both Cairo and Doha are also allowing some Palestinians as well as foreign nationals to cross into Egypt to be either treated in Egyptian hospitals or evacuated to Qatar as well for the same reason.
And what kind of treatment will they receive? And you say they will be returned to Gaza. Is there any kind of time frame on that?
No, there's no time frame, but as you know, the war has pretty much decimated Gaza's health system, and only 17 or so out of 36 hospitals are currently only partially functioning. Plus, the main Rafah crossing for medical transfers out of Gaza to Egypt and the Gulf has been shut since May, when Israel ramped up its military campaign in southern Gaza. So the Strip, as we just heard, needs medical corridors like the one we're talking about today. And the 95 patients evacuated today included people suffering from cancer, blood and kidney diseases and trauma from the war. So there will be no treatment for injuries as such, only for diseases and traumas.
And the UAE has really been at the forefront of aid efforts in Gaza, hasn't it?
Yeah, first there's this polio vaccination campaign, which is not easy from a logistical point of view. It includes setting up a system to ensure that hundreds of thousands of vaccines are stored at the right temperature from the time they are manufactured to the moment they are administered. And with the absence of fully functioning hospitals in Gaza, doctors have to go basically from one hotspot to another according to a sort of roadmap that obviously has to be spared by IDF operations. Besides, the UAE has also sent hundreds of cargo planes, of trucks, airdrops and cargo ships. And on the Egyptian side, several water desalination plants, again financed in large part by Abu Dhabi, have been providing hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of drinking water to Gazans daily. And all this, is obviously about politics as well, and of the pawns, so to speak, that the Emiratis are advancing to make sure they have a role to play in Gaza once this war is over. They want to extend their influence in the Gaza Strip, whether on a humanitarian, economic or political level, in a region that the Emiratis have always had difficulty penetrating in the past because of their very poor relations and bad relations with Hamas and other Palestinian factions there.
Bastien, thank you very much. Bastien Bourri there over in the UAE. Well, Asher Fredman, as you know, the relationship between Israel and the UAE, facilitated by the Abraham Accords, is part of the reason that civilians can be evacuated out of Gaza right now.
That's absolutely correct. The UAE has played a leading role in providing humanitarian aid in Gaza, as has Morocco, and that's been made possible because of the diplomatic ties and also the ties of trust, the working relationships that have been built because of the Abraham Accords. That's allowed the UAE and Morocco to play such a major role in Gaza as well.
Okay, thank you. Turkey has lashed out at a new defence cooperation agreement signed between the United States and Cyprus, calling it a threat to Turkish Cypriot security. US Assistant Secretary of Defence for International Security Affairs, Celeste Wallander, signed that agreement in Nicosia with her counterpart, Vasilis Balmas. He hailed it as a strong commitment to deepening the partnership between the two countries. But Turkey says this deal undermines Washington's neutral stance on Cyprus, which has been divided since 1974, when Turkish soldiers invaded and occupied the north of the island. Well, with me in the studio, Dr. Hayetan Cohen-Yanarocak is a Turkey expert at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Good to see you, Hayetan.
Good to see you too.
As always, why is Turkey so angry about this move?
Well, we should understand their anger. This is very logical, very reasonable, very, makes sense, because at the end of the day, this deal is putting an end to 50 years of U.S. policy of imposing an arms embargo on Republic of Cyprus. In 1974, when Turkey intervened in Cyprus militarily, in order to de-escalate the situation, the American administration then imposed a unilateral embargo, arms embargo, and since then they are not providing any weaponry, any ammunition to the Republic of Cyprus. But since 2020, we began to see a gradual change in the American policy. Then they partially lifted it, and 2 years ago, then they lifted for good. And now we are seeing this deal. But when we are looking back, I think we should not be surprised, because at the end of the day, Turkey is also conducting a rapprochement towards America's adversaries, namely Russia. And only last week they declared their intention to become a part of the BRICS. What is
so
BRICS?
China as well.
Yes.
China, Russia.
Yes, China, Russia, South Africa, India, right? Of course, Iran as well there. So this organization is seeking de-dollarization, meaning that they are trying to weaken the United States' domination in the world. And as a result, this is a two-way street. If you are basically taking these kind of decisions, inevitably also the United States will get similar decisions. And, this is what we call realism in the international relations.
How worried is Erdogan about the Cypriot relationship with Israel? Because they do have a strong relationship. And in fact, Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist organization, directly threatened Cyprus if it got too involved in helping Israel in the war.
In my opinion, the current American decision is also derived because of Cypriot government's strong identification with the state of Israel. They are supporting Israel since the beginning of the war. It's not a secret. So they are declaring their side in a very clear manner. The Cypriots, together with the Greeks, are standing next to the state of Israel and the United States. And as far as I understand, the Americans are seeing it. And of course, we should not also underestimate the geostrategic importance of Cyprus. It is like a permanent aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's not an ordinary state that it is producing halloumi cheese, right? It's not only that. It's not only the beaches. It's the geostrategic location. Yes. What we say, location, location, location. So in this regard, I think the United States will deepen its influence in Cyprus. And let us also not forget, also Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, he threatened Cyprus. In the same week, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, he also threatened Cyprus because of its pro-Israel stance. So now, as far as I understand, the Cypriots are harvesting their clear stance with the state of Israel.
Is there a risk Erdogan might do something, might become more aggressive?
We may see in the very near future some inaugurations of new army bases, as a so-called retaliation. Of course, in Cyprus, we may see an increasing presence of the Turkish Navy, or maybe the drilling ships. They may violate the Cypriot exclusive economic zones. So I think, never a dull moment in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East. I think we are blessed. That's why we are called. Yeah, that's why we are living in the promised land, and all of our neighborhood. We are very much blessed.
Nobody's going to die of boredom, that's for sure. All right, Dr. Koren Yenerojek, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Islamists have won the biggest share of the vote following elections in Jordan. The Islamic Action Front, a political offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, won 31 out of 138 seats, meaning they've more than doubled their share of parliament since 2016. They are benefiting from public anger over the war in Gaza. More than half of Jordanians are Palestinians. So Asher Friedman, Ariel Saran, with me in the studio. This, of course, Asher, just a few days after a Jordanian, not a Palestinian citizen, slaughtered 3 Israeli border guards on the Allenby Bridge. Is Jordanian society becoming increasingly radical, and how much of a problem is that for Israel?
For many years, we've seen anti-Israel incitement, demonization, at times blatant anti-Semitism in the Jordanian public sphere, education system. The monarchy, the king, was always careful to keep the Islamists in check, also because they pose a threat to his own rule, to the stability of the government. But we're seeing that during the war, because of the groundwork of the incitement and of the Islamist anti-Israel sentiment, it's becoming stronger and stronger and finding expression in different ways, whether it's a terror attack or whether it's elections.
Ariel, the security cooperation between Israel and Jordan has managed to hold despite all the pressures upon it. Can it hold much longer, do you think, in the current climate?
Also with Egypt, despite what the leaders are saying, and that, I think, illustrates the discrepancy between the position of the Jordanian leadership, not the political leadership, the top Hashemite royal court, that leadership. The political leadership is, I think, moving more and more towards a public sentiment of incitement or disagreement with even the existence of Israel. But we do see that the national interest, security interest of that man on the screen, King Abdullah II, remain the same. I think what is interesting following the results of these elections, that they came after changing the election laws in Jordan to try and weaken the force of the Islamist elements, trying to reduce the power from the major cities, taking it to the periphery. I think what the Jordanian top leadership was learned, I think the hard way, is that also in the periphery, Islamist elements have a growing influence, and that is obviously concerning moving forward, could strain on relations with Israel, but as long as the security interests of Israel and Jordan continue to align, we will see this coordination continue unabated.
All right, Ariel, thank you very much indeed. And Asher Friedman from the Miscavige, thank you to you as well.
Thank you very much.
Now, the British government has scrapped a visa-free travel arrangement with Jordan, citing misuse of the scheme. Large numbers of Jordanians have been using it to travel on to Central America and then try and get into the United States via the southern border. Well, for more on that, we can go to London and our correspondent, Jonathan Sacerdotti. So, Jonathan, take us back. Why was this scheme put in place initially?
The UK introduced the Electronic Travel Authorization, or ETA scheme, primarily to streamline travel for visitors from certain Middle Eastern countries, including Jordan. It was initially rolled out for Qatar in late 2023 and expanded in February 2024 to include Jordan and other Gulf nations. The ETA system aimed to simplify visa processes while boosting tourism and business ties with countries that had a high rate of repeat visitors to the UK. And by making travel cheaper, faster and more accessible, the scheme was intended to strengthen the UK's relations with those nations, allowing easier movement for tourism, business, short-term visits, things like that, without the need for a full visa application. And the UK government also saw it as a way to enhance border control because there's pre-screening of visitors, and that would help to better manage who was entering the country while maintaining positive diplomatic relations with key allies in the Middle East. And finally, the scheme was part of a broader effort to modernise the UK's immigration and border control by digitising the systems and making that process more efficient for travellers in the airports as well.
But it seems it wasn't quite working as intended, Jonathan. How were people abusing this scheme exactly?
The ETA scheme for Jordanian nationals was abused in multiple ways, prompting the UK to revoke it now. Primarily, a significant increase in asylum claims by Jordanian nationals was observed shortly after the scheme's implementation. The number of asylum claims by Jordanians surged from 17 in the last quarter of 2023 to 261 by mid-2024. There are allegations that some Jordanian nationals had claimed asylum in Ireland while purporting to be Palestinian citizens. Many individuals were entering the UK under the guise of short-term visits, but they were instead seeking asylum when they got here. And the practice put pressure on the UK border operations, and so there was a sharp rise in border refusals, and that indicated that many travellers weren't actually adhering to the rules set out for the visitors, for visitor purposes. So another form of abuse that was going on apparently involved Jordanians using the UK as a transit point to seek asylum elsewhere in other countries like Ireland, or even attempting to reach the US through Latin America. Organised criminal networks were apparently exploiting the scheme, with individuals paying traffickers to navigate those routes. And the rise in those activities led to significant operational strains on UK border resources and highlighted the misuse of the scheme for purposes beyond the original intention. So that's why they've now come to this conclusion that actually not that long after introducing it, it needs to be ended.
And historically, Jonathan, Jordan and the UK do enjoy very warm relations, don't they? Especially between the two royal families. Is there any sign that this might damage relations at all?
I certainly think that's something that they will hope is not an effect of cancelling it. As I said, I think the intention of introducing the ETA for Jordanians was to actually build on those strong relations. But I think that there was some warning given from the UK government, the new UK government, that this wasn't working so well. There was a bit of warning that this would happen. And to ease the transition as well, there is a little bit of leeway of a few weeks for people who already have travel plans made and have their ETA. But I suspect that there's no getting around the numbers. If they are able to show that it's being abused in that way, hopefully it won't dent relations between the two countries, but it will simply be a matter of pointing to the facts as they are in black and white and showing that things work better before the other way.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Jonathan Sacerdote there over in London. Well, here in Israel, the price of fruit and vegetables have soared since the war began, and Israeli farmers are unable to reach their lands in parts of the north, of course, parts of the country that have been evacuated because of the ongoing attacks by the Hezbollah terrorist group. But an exodus of foreign workers is also driving up costs. Now, though, volunteers are helping to keep farms afloat. More in this report.
This greenhouse, now it's empty. It's usually on the winter, it's full of tomato. It's like 100 ton. And because of the war, I didn't plant new seeds.
This is Yossi Inbal. He's a farmer from southern Israel. Every year, his farm produces around 700 tons of fresh produce. But when the war began on October 7th and Hamas violently infiltrated Israel, everything fell apart.
At the beginning of the war, most of the workers just ran away. We stayed without worker, and we couldn't continue do our business, to plant the new seeds and grow new vegetables. I can't do it by myself. Pick all 5 acres of tomato. Yeah. A lot of it just go down to garbage. On October 7, we woke up of the sound of the rocket and the siren. We took the children, we just drove like crazy, far away from this area with the terrorists. And we got lucky. My wife, she was born in Kibbutz Be'eri. My wife's grandmother, she got shot, passed away 2 weeks after.
Yossi's farm and home is in Moshav Oat, just 5 miles away from the Gaza border. When the war started, his family was forced to evacuate for over half a year. But Yossi decided to come back the very next day to try and convince his farm workers to stay on the farm.
How many workers do you need to actually harvest these vegetables?
About 15.
So you're saying you need 15 workers for this greenhouse?
For this greenhouse. So
and you lost half of the workers when the war began?
Yeah, but I don't have one greenhouse. I have many.
Most of the farm workers in Israel are foreigners, and many have fled the country since the outbreak of the war, causing the agricultural sector's workforce to go down by about 40%. The labor shortage has triggered a major food crisis, and the impact has been particularly rough for farms close to the Gaza Strip, a region that's responsible for 75% of Israeli vegetable production.
How were you able to at least save some of the vegetables that you had here?
The beauty of the Israeli people, when you need them, they come to help you.
Yeah.
Many, like thousands of Israeli came from the center, from the cities to help us.
Right.
Every day, they help us, they save us.
Nobody talks a lot about the impact that the war had on the farmers. They don't have any help. I try to come here once a week to pick up any vegetables they need or any kind of help they need.
That's Stephanie. She is a volunteer for the food rescue organization Leket, which has been sending tens of thousands of volunteers to farms across the country that have been badly impacted because of the war.
I normally buy lemons in a supermarket, and I'm hearing the impact of not having enough workers to get the weeds off the trees, and therefore the lemons are smaller, and there's just not enough people to keep the farms running.
The farmer here told us that if he didn't have volunteers, he would have had to shut down.
But it's not just the farmers whose livelihoods are taking a hit. The entire country is suffering as a result.
During the first 6 months of the war, 150,000 tons of agricultural produce went to waste. That is 22% of Israel's national agricultural production. During that time, food waste cost the Israeli economy $275 million. And as a result of the shortage of fresh produce because of that hit on local farming, vegetable prices have risen by 18%, and fruit prices have risen by 12%. The good news is that there is work being done to prevent this issue. Since the war started, tens of thousands of volunteers have gathered to save over 35,000 tons of fresh produce. That's worth $50 million.
We're at the Leket warehouse. So all the produce that you see here has been picked by volunteers. It's going to be, of course, delivered to people in need. 300,000 people all over the country weekly. It's about 20% of the population in Israel suffers from some sort of food insecurity, and 20% is about 2 million people.
Leket has been feeding the needy for over a decade by collecting and redistributing food that would otherwise be thrown away by farmers or restaurants.
You see these are small avocados, and again it goes down to what the farmers can pick. If they have a grove of avocados that are ripe and ready to be picked and are the large size and the market will want them, that's what they're going to pick. And in the past, they would wait until this would grow somewhat and then pick this as well. Now, they just don't have the labor for it. They don't have the manpower because the labor will come and pick the next grove that has, again, the large avocados, and these are left behind. So that's why we're there, and we're trying to pick as much as we can. This would have been thrown away.
But there's another issue here. The fact that so much produce is left unharvested because of the war will affect Israel's long-term agricultural output. Trees that aren't properly pruned won't produce as much fruit in the next season. And this is particularly a serious issue in the north of Israel, which is constantly under rocket fire from the terror group Hezbollah out of Lebanon. Many farms there are just too dangerous to access.
Most of the food grows in the north of the country. You can't reach the groves to just pick it.
Do you have volunteers who are going to the north as well?
Absolutely. We try not to bring them to areas that there's immediate shelling, but you can't know. From what I heard from farmers that we spoke to, that I've met, they're saying only about 70% will go back. Who's going to farm the land?
Leket has been doing everything it can to try and support local farmers, even providing them with financial grants to cover their losses, since many say that they feel completely abandoned by the Israeli government. But even so, the looming question is whether or not the Israeli farming industry will ever be able to go back to what it once was.
Farmers are cutting down because they're not sure if they can pick or not, because that's the most labor-intensive part of their work. So they're saying instead of growing a plot of, 100 dunams, I'll do 40 dunams. Prices are skyrocketing anyway. I'll probably make the same money. And all balances at the end of the day on economics.
But luckily for Israel, economics aren't the only issue that matter to local farmers. And many, like Yossi, say they won't abandon ship, no matter what happens.
As a farmer, it's my responsibility for the country of Israel, or the people of Israel, to supply them the vegetable. They count on us, and we never give up. Although the war is still going on, it's the only country we have. We need to take care of it.
Very hard and thankless work there, the farmers of Israel, doing a great job keeping us all fed. Well, that's it for this edition of Middle East Now. Do stay with us on I24 News. We'll have more as Khaled Ben David brings you tonight's rundown. Good night.
Sail for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad. With renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayasad.fr.
As Israel steps up its attacks on terror targets across the northern border, reports allege the IDF carried out a major covert operation in Syria straight out of a Hollywood movie. We'll take a closer look. Israel and UNRWA trade charges over an airstrike on a Gaza school being used as a Hamas command center that the UN claims killed 6 aid workers. We'll have the latest. A happy ending in the story of a 4-year-old boy who accidentally broke a rare antique jar on display in an Israeli museum. We'll tell you how. This is the Rundown on I-24 News. I'm Khaled Ben David. In Israel's war in the north, most of its cross-border fire and airstrikes are being aimed at Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Less frequent and rarely admitted to by the IDF are airstrikes in Syria. Today, the IDF did make an admission of carrying out 2 strikes in Syria, one eliminating Ahmed al-Jabir, a top terrorist in the Golan File Unit, a Syrian affiliate of Hezbollah, and a second strike at a terrorist operative said to be working under Iranian guidance. But it's another alleged operation in Syria that Israel has not acknowledged, which is generating bigger headlines today, and if true, would constitute a major covert action on Syrian territory. Middle East correspondent Ariel Osran has the details.
What was initially believed to be an unusual series of Israeli airstrikes in Syria early Monday turns out to be closer to the plot of a Hollywood action movie.
كشفت مصادر خاصة لتلفزيون سوريا تفاصيل الضربات التي نفذتها إسرائيل على منطقة مصياف قبل يومين، حيث نفذت القوات الإسرائيلية عملية إنزال جوي على مركز البحوث العلمية في مصياف. تمكنت خلالها تل أبيب من اختطاف إيرانيين 2.
Syrian opposition TV and a Greek researcher separately reported that the dramatic raid, which lasted an hour, began with a series of airstrikes on the research center, the surrounding roads, and military facilities. Then, Israeli commando forces were airdropped into an IRGC military facility for developing ballistic missiles and drones, withdrawing with important equipment and documents, including the reported capture of 2 to 4 Iranian officers. The forces then laid charges and exploded the site, destroying it completely, before pulling out under heavy air support. Both Syria and Iran denied the reports.
This aggression came in waves. It was a brutal and savage aggression. Till now, we have 18 killed and 37 injured. The injuries vary from critical to light. The health sector in Hama is doing its best by providing necessary aid to the injured.
Meanwhile, an Israeli drone eliminated a Hezbollah operative in the Quneitra countryside in southwest Syria, the IDF said, further illustrating how Syria has become a support front for Iran's Lebanese proxy. Throughout the day, Hezbollah launched over a dozen rockets and numerous drones at northern Israel's western Galilee, causing no injuries but sparking fires in the area. The IDF said it struck a Hezbollah site and rocket launcher in southern Lebanon. With tensions between the sides running high, the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, visited the volatile border and called on Lebanese diplomats to silence the drums of war.
We need to de-escalate military tensions. And I use this opportunity to urge all sides to pursue this path.
Borrell called for an immediate implementation of the 2006 UN resolution aimed at preventing hostilities.
I avail myself of this opportunity to reiterate Lebanon's commitment to the comprehensive and balanced implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701.
Stay tuned, but don't hold your breath.
Well, from all, let's go to our correspondent in the north near the Lebanese border, Zach Anders. Zach, Josep Borrell, notwithstanding the fighting goes on there in the north and another active day of fire across the border. Bring us up to date.
Hi, good afternoon, Clev. We're looking at 9 attacks Hezbollah has claimed responsibility for. Don't have any reports of casualties. We don't have any damage to speak of to homes or businesses. But there have been fires that were started by earlier rocket attacks. I know that one fire is still seeing active crews. It looks like These fires have been burning themselves out today, at least, rather quickly. They weren't into any thick vegetation or scrub. What has been interesting to watch, Ariel did a great job outlining what's been taking place in Syria, of course, with the IDF in rare admissions not talking about this potential raid on a IRGC-affiliated site. But the IDF is coming out in a rare statement and saying that they were behind drone strikes in Syria. It's not the first time over the course of this conflict, but you can count on one hand the number of times the IDF has come out and said that they were performing activity inside Syria. So that's something to watch, of course, is this Syrian front. Really, the Syrian involvement here is taking shape in interesting ways. The way I somewhat look at this is that border between Lebanon and Syria is pretty much non-existent. And has shown itself to be very porous throughout the course of this conflict, of course, that Hezbollah is operating in Syria just as much as they are in Lebanon. At least they have the freedom of movement to move about their weapons and their personnel between these soft, non-existent borders. What we have been watching very intently is a strike in Nabatea. This appears to be on a motorcycle. We're seeing reports of multiple casualties. What is unclear is, the target intended. This does look like it was a drone strike. But since that Nabatea strike, again, this is about 70 miles north of the border. In the early days of this war, it would have been quite remarkable. And we were talking about how remarkable it was in the early days that there were strikes, limited strikes, deep inside Lebanese territory. Recently, over the course of the summer, it's been very frequent and much more common to see these strikes take place all throughout Lebanon. So not necessarily the location where the strike taking place, but potentially who was the intended target is the more interesting element that we're watching here. And we have not seen Hezbollah announce any activity on their Telegram channels or perform any additional attacks. And we haven't had a red alarm here for several hours. So if this was somebody that, cuts deep or a prominent figure within their ranks or potentially within another terror group, we have seen fairly large responses. It's common to see a fairly large Hezbollah response or a rocket attack that follows any of these targeted drone strikes. Haven't seen that yet. So we're watching here in Kiryat Shmona. We're waiting, anticipating that there could be an additional attack at some point tonight. Of course, the attacks here are nightly and, average about 10 a night anyways. So we'll keep on this. It's something that usually we will start to understand more within 24 hours who the intended target was, or Hezbollah themselves will announce the death. So that's something to look out for.
Right. One point worth just mentioning is that, Zach, of course, if that Syrian front should heat up, of course, Syria is bordering on the Golan Heights, where the civilian communities have not been evacuated, like you there in Kiryat Shmona. Unfortunately, in the last couple of months, we've seen some rockets falling in the Golan Heights, which has caused some serious civilian casualties. So certainly that's not something Israel wants to see. Zach Gand is there in Kiryat Shmona. Thank you for that, Zach. And joining us in studio, we have Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital, the former commander of Special Forces, and our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran. Doron, if there was such an operation that included the use of actually putting Israeli boots on the ground in Syrian territory, that's usually the kind of thing your former unit that you commanded, Sayeret Matkal, would take part in, and of course we understand why Israel would not take responsibility, or maybe even the Syrians would not want to admit that. But does it sound plausible? Is that the kind of operation that the IDF and the commando units you were part of would be carrying out?
For sure, it's within the capabilities to do such a thing in terms of what the IDF and the unit I commanded and other units can do. It requires, of course, very definite planning, a lot of intelligence together, and also the operational planning, how to isolate the area, how to make sure that you can also rescue your soldiers if something goes wrong. If it's Israel, this is a great operation we have to salute. On a humorous note, I would say I don't think it's the Americans, because they usually we all the time make a joke that they leave a chopper down. We do not. So it's
that's a reference to the Osama bin Laden assassination and maybe the attempted Iranian.
Only two forces, even though it took place, only two forces in this arena that can operate in such a fashion: the U.S. and Israel. Clearly, Israel can do it, and I always say that precision and the ability to execute operations like this in such a fashion, this is part of our deterrence, because we show the enemy that we can do it, that we know where they are, and we can actually get there and do it. So let's see.
Ariel, you've stressed in previous reports here that Syria has been, I won't say the quiet front, because there's certainly been action there, but we haven't seen the Syria and certainly Bashar Assad take as active a part as, for example, Hezbollah and even some of the other Iranian proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, and even the Iraqi militias. If Israel were to have carried out this kind of operation on Syrian territory, would you expect that kind of thing to continue? What could be the consequences?
Well, I think it further highlights the fact that Syria is a launch pad for Iranian and Hezbollah launches towards Israel, and it's a storage facility for Iranian and Hezbollah
and a transit point.
And a transit point, and that's where this facility comes into play, because for years Israel has been targeting weapons transfers from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel has been targeting a lot of those, whether they came through the airport in Damascus or Aleppo, or coming in from the ground routes via Iraq and Syria. And in frustration, reportedly, even though Israel has acknowledged one or two.
When Kochavi was the chief of staff,
they have admitted, yes. However, and my understanding is that in the frustration of this reality, about 6 years ago, Iran built this facility, built deep inside the mountain in Masyaf, to try and make its transport of weapons more efficient, rather than having to go through all that rigmarole, so that they can build their precision missiles on Syrian soil, and then the transfer time from there to Lebanon, Hezbollah in Lebanon, is a lot shorter, and that makes this a very strategic site in use of Hezbollah and Iran. That's why Israel struck it, but it's not strategic for Syria. It's strategic in Syria. And that, I think, is the difference that you in your question outlined, that the Israeli strikes are on Syria, not necessarily against Syrians, even though in recent months Israel has targeted has targeted Syrian military assets in Syria, but only assets that have been assisting Iranian forces and Hezbollah, not necessarily the standing army that just
well, to your point, if these reports are accurate, this facility seems to have been manned in part by Iranians, since the report says Israel or whoever took hostage to Iranians, and not, for example, Syrians.
And the IRGC is quick to deny these reports, saying that not only was this not an Iranian facility, but there were no Iranians on the ground. And for sure there were this according to the IRGC, no Iranians were kidnapped or captured during this operation. As Syrian opposition TV reported, they said between 2 to 4 Iranian officers were eliminated. They also added, this is striking, that locals have accused the Syrian regime of cordoning the area of the operation that prevented ambulances and reinforcements from coming. Obviously, we cannot corroborate this, but this just shows the level of how Syrians are frustrated with Iran and Hezbollah using their country as a launch pad, as a storage facility for their weapons.
All right.
And not taking responsibility on our behalf if it's indeed us. It's very important, because it doesn't require for them to counterattack, not the Syrian and nor the Iranian. So if it was done by Israelis, it was done beautifully and perfect execution.
Well, maybe one day we'll know the truth of what happened in this particular operation.
We'll see it on Netflix.
Or we'll see it on Netflix, the documentary, right? Now, in Israel's multi-frontal war, most of the attention has been placed either on Israel's northern border, as we just spoke, or on, of course, the Gaza area. But in the last month, Israel has shifted a lot of its focus onto the West Bank and is in the midst of conducting its largest counter-terror operation there in years. But the terror attacks go on, and the IDF's efforts are now being complicated by the continuing blowback from the U.S. over the fatal shooting of a Turkish-American pro-Palestinian activist. Joe Brown has the latest.
The largest counter-terror operation in a generation, Israel is striking the West Bank hard, whilst receiving tragic reminders as to why they are doing this. Late on Wednesday night, the IDF confirmed it was striking in Tulkarem in the northwest of the West Bank, a city the IDF has focused a lot of its recent operations in. According to reports on the ground, 3 people were killed after a vehicle was struck. This comes a day after an IDF strike in Tubas in northeast of the West Bank killed 5. And in between these strikes, another terror attack, as an oil tanker driven by a West Bank resident rammed into a bus stop in Givat Asaf near Ramallah, killing IDF soldier Geri Gideon Hankal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sent his condolences to Hankal's family whilst on a visit to the Israel-Jordan border, where he vowed to stop the smuggling of weapons from Jordan into the West Bank.
In this multi-front struggle, we know that we need to secure our eastern border with Jordan. This is a border of peace. We are partnering with the Kingdom of Jordan to ensure that it remains so. But in recent days, the challenges have grown. There is an attempt to smuggle both terrorists and weapons across Jordan into Judea and Samaria and into the cities of Israel.
And another front that Netanyahu has to worry about is the international arena. Amid mounting criticism of Israel from its allies as the war in Gaza progresses, tensions with the US were exacerbated by the killing of Aysenur Agi, a Turkish-born American peace activist who was killed during a protest against the IDF near Nablus last week. Whilst the IDF has said that she was, quote, likely killed by the IDF, a new report from the Washington Post has added a new layer to the story. According to reports, Agi was shot by the IDF 20 minutes after clashes amongst protesters dispersed, and around 200 meters away from the site, suggesting that it was intentional. The IDF says that the incident is under investigation.
I want justice for Aysenur and I want justice for her family, and so I hope that the administration and the U.S. government will launch an independent investigation.
Last Saturday, the IDF officially wrapped up its 10-day raid on refugee camps in the West Bank. But the fight against terror cells in the region is not slowing down anytime soon.
Well, for more, let's go to our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim in Washington, D.C. And Mike, some of us with long memories can recall the Rachel Corrie case in Gaza. More recently, Shireen Abu Akleh, her shooting in the journalist for Al Jazeera in the West Bank. We heard a young woman there, a friend of Agi, saying that she'd like to see the U.S. push forward for an independent investigation. How much likely pressure will be there from Washington to do that?
None right now, and that's because the State Department says that Israel, has acknowledged that they are almost assuredly at fault for this particular incident, even though, as President Joe Biden said in the initial report, it appears to be as a result of a ricochet. But beyond that, what the State Department is saying right now is that Israel has already launched a military police investigation, so it's going beyond just the initial government investigation into a possible criminal investigation. And that's something that the American government takes as a serious sign, a sign that Israel is serious about investigating itself here, serious about accountability. And so the State Department is saying it's going to let that process play out, see what comes of it before any further potential action is taken here by the Biden administration. There is no doubt that there's anger emanating from the State Department. We heard harsh words from Secretary of State Tony Blinken a couple of days ago saying that the incident was unprovoked and unjustified. We've heard already statements from President Biden and Vice President Harris to that effect as well, saying that the IDF essentially needs to review its rules of engagement, needs to make sure that these incidents don't play out over and over again. Again, though, letting it play out right now in terms of the police investigation that's been launched, and I don't expect we'll see calls for further action from the Biden admin until that investigation is complete. However, there are calls from certain corners of Congress, including from the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, for the U.S. to take the lead and launch its own investigation in parallel or possibly in opposition to Israel's own investigation that's ongoing.
All right, Mike Wagenheim there at the State Department, we should say. Mike, thank you for that. And Doron, it's a tough, the IDF already has a tough mission there, trying to keep a lid on the terror attacks and the unrest in the West Bank, and how much this is further complicate a difficult task there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have so many fronts. We've been discussing Syria, and we forgot this terrible front in the northern Samaria, where the Palestinian Authority has no command, no control. We are trying right now to work out some system to support some kind of force of the Palestinian Authority to help us in the northern Samaria. I hope it would work, not clear. And then incidents like this happen. In the landscape of war, it's hard sometimes to see who is who. Of course, it has to be investigated, and our credibility is on the line here. And to make sure things like this do not happen, it's a tragedy. But we have a real war in northern Samaria, and we have to acknowledge it.
Right, a real war in the north of the West Bank, Ariel, and increasingly the IDF is, we should mention reports, security officials in recent, just in recent days, apparently warning of a situation that could explode and that could get worse. For example, we could see a lot of the activity, the terror activity, has been in the northern West Bank, and concerns, of course, if the southern West Bank, especially Hebron, could also become a more of a hotbed of this kind of violent terrorist actions.
And that's why we've seen Israeli forces who have been operating in the area for about 2 years intensively. Since the start of the war, they have amplified those efforts, because while the terror organizations in Gaza, they're limited in what they can carry out against Israelis, they're trying to export that to the West Bank. And I think the description of the West Bank as being on the verge of exploding, it is perhaps misleading for the viewers, or confusing, because it's not like the same binary situation as in the Gaza. It's either just launching rockets or the biggest massacre Israel has ever seen. In the West Bank, it's a lot more gradual, a lot more continuous, perhaps at a lower threshold, but more ongoing. And that is the reality. I think the West Bank is exploding right now.
Well, certainly in the north it is, you have to say. The biggest anti-terror operation. Terror attacks, and of course we've seen on the Palestinian side very heavy casualties among the terror organizations there.
And we report what the terror organizations succeed in carrying out, but Israeli authorities, security authorities, have thwarted dozens, if not hundreds, of attacks since the start of the war, both on Israelis in the West Bank and in Israel proper. And we see these attempts amplifying in the capabilities that they're using, and that is a major concern. These more powerful Iranian-made explosive devices that Prime Minister Netanyahu alluded to, that make their way via Jordan into the northern West Bank, that is a significant threat to Israeli forces operating in the West Bank. In the absence of proper Palestinian sovereignty, Israeli forces have to operate there. So that is a significant threat to them, but also the threat to Israeli civilians in Israel proper and in the West Bank. You see the increased attempts to carry out these explosive attacks. We saw the failed attack in Tel Aviv, among others. Just in the past 2 weeks alone, there have been between 4 and 5 successful and failed car bombings in the West Bank. That is an uptick that we have not seen until now, and that is a significant concern for Israeli forces, and that explains why we're seeing what is going on right now in the northern West Bank.
All right, well, unfortunately.
What we don't have yet is we don't have intifada in the sense of public demonstration.
Widespread civil
sort of a terror-induced sort of intifada in the northern Samaria, and we have to watch out for Hebron, and of course the border with Jordan, which is the longest border that Israel has, and smuggling there is not easy, but pretty possible.
Well, Benjamin, the Prime Minister, made that clear yesterday when he was looking at the border. And let's stay focused on the military. There was another significant resignation from the IDF today. Brigadier General Yossi Sariel, commander of the elite 8200 intelligence unit that primarily handles signal intelligence, has reported to have handed in his resignation. Now, this follows the departure of his commander, military intelligence commander Aaron Haliva, just a few months ago. Sariel reportedly took personal responsibility for the unit's failures on October 7th, writing in his resignation letter that 8200 did prepare scenarios of possible mass Hamas attacks, but he, quote, failed to understand the need and therefore did not adequately reflect the requirements of the unique reality at the Gaza border. Certainly, that unit in particular, I mean, there are many failures leading up to October 7th. Certainly, that particular unit should have picked up some signs of a possible attack. But the question is this a resignation overdue, or are we facing a situation of having it done in the middle, again, in the middle of a conflict, of a war, such a sensitive unit?
To take responsibility doesn't mean usually resign now, because you have responsibility. You're in the midst of a war. You can't hand the keys to somebody who's not competent enough or not matured enough. And I think that's what he did. I read the letter, responsible letter, and when he felt that the time has come and the war in Gaza is in a certain phase that he can allow himself to take this break and give the keys to somebody else. 8200 was the unit that everybody took pride in Israel.
Absolutely.
Not only in the military, also in the high-tech industry. There was a time in which my unit, Sayeret Matkal, the commander unit, still is called Die Unit, but then I've been hearing people calling 8200 Die Unit.
Right.
Because it was really a symbol of our competency in intelligence, and this is why its failure is so devastating, and he did the right step in the right time.
Ariel, you have 40 seconds as someone who served in that unit to respond.
Well, I'm not going to defend the conduct of the unit. I think it failed miserably in multiple aspects. Also, in one of its main goals of not just gathering the intel but analyzing it. There were a lot of alerts in the lower level, but they didn't make it up. The analysis was failed. But also, they took down some of the ears on Hamas's tactical operations. Their walkie-talkie capabilities, that wasn't listened to for the year leading up to October 7th. And if you want to thwart an operation on the ground, a tactical operation, you need to cover that.
All right, a major failure. Gentlemen, stay with us. We're going out for a brief break, but lots more coming up on The Rundown.
Sail for the benefit of the victims of October 7th, 2023, supported by the Karen Hayazad. With renowned artists from all over the world on Monday, October 7th, 2024. View the complete catalog and access remote purchase orders on aspacefineart.com and Karen-Hayasad.fr.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to the Rundown on I-24 News. Well, Israel has long accused UNRWA, the UN agency that is primarily responsible for the distribution of aid in Gaza, of collaborating with Hamas, charges that have only intensified since October 7th. The UN, in return, has accused Israel of putting UNRWA workers at risk, including an airstrike on a school that the IDF says was being used as a Hamas command center. More in this report from Robert Swift.
18 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike on a school in the central Gaza Strip, according to the Hamas-run Civil Defense Agency. Among the dead are 6 UNRWA staffers. The UN's chief, Antonio Guterres, announced on X.
We have witnessed a series of military interventions by Israel in Gaza with a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in my time as Secretary General, and with very dramatic violations of international humanitarian law and total absence of an effective protection of civilians.
The attack is the single largest loss of life for the relief agency since the start of the 11-month conflict, with more than 200 staffers killed to date. The school in Nusrat was sheltering some 12,000 displaced Gazans and has been previously struck from the air on 4 other occasions. Israel has long accused UNRWA of being infiltrated by Hamas.
But when you speak about UNRWA, they are not focused on supporting the Palestinians. They focus on incitement and advocacy against Israel. And every time we saw the collaboration with Hamas.
The organization was using the school as a command and control center, an Israeli military spokesperson said, noting that precision weaponry, aerial imagery, and additional intelligence were utilized to mitigate against the risk of civilian casualties. Hamas frequently screens its assets behind Gazan civilians, including in areas the IDF has declared as humanitarian zones. Israeli attacks against such locations have appeared to increase in recent months as Hamas has lost ground, with Gazan civilians and aid workers carrying the cost.
And still with us in studio, Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital and our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osran. And Doron, we talked about the complications in the West Bank, much more so even now in Gaza. Another illustration of this, but I think intensifying in the sense that, and I think Robert mentions this in the report, that as the IDF closes in, as it were, on Hamas, it is increasingly using whatever civilian facilities, especially those associated with UNRWA, in a sense, as shields, as covering. And unfortunately, this is the dilemma that's facing the IDF. And in some cases, there are civilians killed. There are some aid workers killed. But in some of these cases, Israel's saying these aid workers are actually affiliated with Hamas.
Yeah, this is the dilemma of the battlefield. Of course, you have to be very precise, well-planned, and have the right intelligence, because there can be also mistakes in intelligence. I think the case here is more of a clear case that we knew the terrorists are taking refuge in those places, and we are trying to take them out. Tragedy in the battlefield all the time comes out, of course, like this tragedy. We have to be very careful and keep being careful, being more and more precise. But this is the landscape of war that we are part of.
Right, and there's an irony because, Ariel, the IDF is saying it's basically decimated Hamas as a military force, military structure, and this is basically fighting a guerrilla war now, and there was more of that today. But, of course, when you're fighting guerrillas, this is the tactic that they use to try to place themselves or even disguise themselves as civilians.
Exactly. And as the more the destruction of their militarized formation continues, they will opt to carry out or to conduct themselves in a more guerrilla warfare type, as you described. And not that they needed a reason or an excuse to embed themselves in these sensitive, not only civilian but humanitarian sites above and below ground. We see that as the IDF forces continue to pummel the Hamas battalions, just this evening announcing the destruction of the Rafah battalion completely. That doesn't mean that they have eliminated all of Hamas fighters or Hamas's fighting capabilities. Let's just, for example, the IDF said that it destroyed the battalions in the north. In northern Gaza alone, Hamas has already recruited between 3,000 and 4,000 new Gazans to its ranks, and they are the fighting force. So they're not military trained as the ones who they replaced are, but they're still a fighting force, fighting against Israel, but also to try and keep the Hamas policing capabilities and intimidation tactics on their local communities.
All right. Now, of course, when we talk about Gaza, we have to talk about the most important issue, the hostages. Well, there are still contacts being made, and the U.S. is expected to present another one of its bridging proposals in a couple of days. The hostage families and their supporters are again out on the streets of Tel Aviv tonight, urging the government to do more to try to reach a deal. Let's go to our Emily Francis, who is with the protesters outside IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, and give us a sense of what you're hearing there and seeing there this evening, Emily.
Hey, good evening, Caleb. Yeah, listen, as you can hear, there is still a concerted effort to continue to call on the government to find a hostage deal, to come up with a hostage deal. About a week ago, they did something similar here with lighting a fire as a sign of emergency. There, hold on, take a listen. So they're chanting. They're saying they're still in Gaza. Now the police are coming here to check out what's going on with the fire. As you can see, the police have been here, obviously, trying to keep the crowds in order, which has generally been the case throughout the past week or so, with the huge protests here in front of the Kiryat tonight. Not quite as many people. In the past nights, they've had to close both sides of the road. But as you can see here, there is continues to be groups of people that are coming here every night to keep the momentum going. Now the police is putting the fire out. So as you can see, people still having energy to come here and fight for whatever it takes. Maybe not quite as many people, given that there has just been evenings of hundreds of thousands of people. Here also, look at this beautiful.
He's now a year and a half. He was kidnapped when he was half.
People home before October 7th. We're almost at October 7th, 1 year, which is really hard to believe that we're still in the same situation. But again, the fight is still going on to make a deal and to bring them home.
All right, Emily Francis out there, a little chaotic in front of IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv. Unfortunately, we do have to say, latest reports are not optimistic. And we should say also the U.S. sources in the United States saying Hamas is being obstructionist and is not compromising on its longstanding position of basically Israel ending its operation to eliminate Hamas, something that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said is a red line, Doron.
I think it's clear to many Israelis, at least more than half of the public, 2/3 of the public, and to the military echelon, that the most important objective in Gaza right now is the hostage deal. And when I sit sometimes in panels and people discuss the interest of the U.S. to force it as part of the election campaign of the Biden administration, this is our obligation to the people that are trapped there. Basically, when the army says that it dismantled the forces of Rafah, for example, of Hamas, basically it says we have been achieving those objectives that that the government asked us to execute, and right now the moment is to come to a hostage deal. So our strategy is very simple. Play with the U.S., play with the moderators, agree with the U.S. on a framework, and then see whether there's a partner on the other side.
All right, well, we'll have to see if that, what kind of response that will be on that. Now let's go back to Gaza for a minute. In contrast to UNRWA, as we just spoke about, there are some aid organizations who have shown you can work successfully in Gaza, even in wartime conditions. The World Health Organization, in cooperation with COGAT, that is the IDF unit that deals with the civilian Palestinian population, has been carrying out a polio vaccination campaign for children in Gaza. Now the WHO has announced that it is confident it has reached its target of vaccinating 90% of Palestinian children in Gaza under age 10. Let's take a listen.
We are happy with this polio campaign. And I think we are also quite confident that we reached an enormous amount of children in this short time. And I think we are confident that we probably reached the target. What we want to reach 90% plus of our target, and then repeat it 4 weeks later.
And that's not all. In another example of WHO cooperation with Israeli authorities, 85 Palestinian patients needing serious medical treatment were evacuated from Gaza via the Kerem Shalom crossing and flown from Ramon Airport to Abu Dhabi for treatment. Here's one of the officials involved in that operation.
We are at the European Gaza Hospital in Gaza. Behind me, we have more than 250 patients and caretakers that tomorrow we're going to cross from Gaza Strip to Kerem Shalom, and from there through Israel to UAE for the continuum of their treatment. This is one of WHO's main activities, making sure that patients are able to secure their continuum of their care outside of the Gaza Strip during this armed conflict.
And Ariel, we focus so much on the sort of chaos in Gaza, but here are two examples where Israel was able to work successfully, especially the vaccination campaign, to have inoculated almost a million children, a 500,000 children with the polio vaccine in these conditions. Is very impressive, and it shows what could be done when there is this cooperation, certainly between the IDF and its units and some elements of the local population.
I think it shows that if Israel were indeed engaged in genocide, that it is very bad at it, and it's kind of undermining its own efforts to target the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. I think another thing that this highlights is that Israel is interested in working with international organizations, and there are some international organizations that can act properly and in good faith in the Gaza Strip. UNRWA is not one of them, and it's positive experiences like this that could facilitate the entry of additional alternative organizations into the Gaza Strip to take care of a much-needed humanitarian element that is exacerbated now, and once the war is over, there will still need to be this cooperation. And this shows that Israel has nothing against working with humanitarian organizations, but when aid organizations present themselves as humanitarian but are indeed often working in cahoots with Hamas, that makes them not a viable partner. The World Health Organization is not accused of any connections with Hamas, and this is working pretty seamlessly. And so this is proof not only to Gazans and to Israelis, but I think to everyone in the world that there is hope for humanitarian avail for the residents of the Gaza Strip. It should not be solely in the hands of UNRWA, perhaps not even at all.
And maybe we in the media should be pointing this out more.
For sure. And we also have to think that right now, we are in a stage in which we have to think of the day after, in terms of, in general, in terms of either the hostage deal, the conclusion of the war in this fashion or another, and of course some kind of forces that we should enter. We are talking about Arab forces, not Palestinian, that might come, that are being considered the day after. This is the discussion that should be taken right now seriously.
And if you want to take the perception of the viewpoint of the PA's prime minister, who wrote in the Washington Post this morning an op-ed outlining the vision of the PA for the day after in the Gaza Strip, the word Hamas does not exist, but they do talk about a non-partisan government to rule Gaza, the Rafah border crossing be managed by the PA, in addition to international security assistance that may be sought by the PA, a reconstruction of Gaza's police force, which is the Hamas police force and appointing interim senior leadership, local leadership. So the Palestinian Authority has brought forth what appears to be a very moderate proposal for the day after. I think many actors, including Israel, the U.S., should take a serious look at this.
But a long way from a Wall Street Journal op-ed to a practical reality on the ground in Gaza. A long way to go.
Look forward to some kind of...
Maybe there should be discussion of that for sure. Now, the Israel-Hamas war has sparked new debate over U.S. military aid to Israel, with the issue being raised everywhere from street protests to the halls of government. Less attention has been paid to the usual second biggest recipient of U.S. military aid, even though it's also playing a role in this conflict. Fabio Shapiro takes a closer look at the U.S. State Department's decision to grant $1.3 billion in military assistance to Egypt, a sign of the war for influence in this region.
The Biden administration will grant $1.3 billion for military aid to Egypt. The State Department informed Congress of its decision not to withhold any of the amount granted annually to the Arab country. In previous years, Washington has retained part of the grant as penalty for the human rights violations, which include cases of torture, illegal killings, jailing of dissidents, electoral suppression, and more. Out of the $1.3 billion, $320 million is usually withheld until pre-established conditions are met.
This decision is important to advancing regional peace and Egypt's specific and ongoing contributions to U.S. national security priorities, particularly to finalize a ceasefire agreement for Gaza, bring the hostages home, surge humanitarian assistance for Palestinians in need, and help bring an enduring end to the Israel-Hamas conflict. We've reiterated with partners in Egypt that more action is needed and expected to build on this trajectory to further strengthen our relationship.
The decision received backlash from many progressive think tanks and politicians, including the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chris Murphy.
It's no secret that Egypt remains a deeply repressive autocratic state, and I see no good reason to ignore that fact by waiving these requirements.
With Egypt playing a significant role in the region, the United States seems to believe it is not a time to create animosity with Cairo. The country is a key player in negotiations in the Sudanese civil war and in the conflict between Hamas and Israel. It acted as a middle ground during the latest hostage deal last year. And despite reports on facilitating smuggling through the Philadelphia corridor, it has worked closely with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority.
From our side, here in Egypt, we are always keen to have a positive role, whether with the Palestinians, Hamas in particular, in cooperation with the Qataris and the United States. But Europe has a great weight. And it's very important during this critical phase to apply additional pressure in order to be able to reach an agreement that achieves stability and lightens the struggle of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Egypt has been busy with diplomatic efforts in the past week. An Egyptian delegation was in Washington for a U.S.-Egypt Joint Economic Commission session, and President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi received German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier and European Council Vice President Joseph Borrell.
Mentioning the dramatic situation in this region, where the confluence of crises poses a direct threat on both Egypt and the European Union security. No solution can work without full engagement and support by Egypt.
Earlier this year, Egypt officially joined the BRICS bloc, aligning itself with China and Russia. Washington's decision to grant Egypt the full aid amount unconditionally may be an attempt to counter that.
Doron, there's no question that Egypt is playing in several ways, acting constructively in the situation, and no surprise the U.S. is rewarding it with this aid. But when the State Department says more action is needed on cooperation, that's being a little diplomatic. Let's talk about that, because especially when it comes to the issue of the Gaza-Egypt border, more action would be needed from Egypt.
We have to have a broad look about the situation. We have to think in terms of real politics. Egypt is in the coalition that we work with. If you think of the logic of the Cold War, it's Soviet weaponry against U.S. weaponry, and right now Egypt is part of the U.S. weaponry in terms of the logic.
And especially against the, say, Iran, Russia axis.
And you think about the Biden corridor, or whatever would be the new name for the Biden corridor comes November, we think of really opening up this corridor in Saudi Arabia, normalization. We have Egypt, we have Jordan as countries that are part of this coalition against the other axis, which is China, Iran, and Russia. So this is the logic, and America plays into this logic smartly, I think.
All right, but again,
of course, from our perspective, we would like more in terms of the Philadelphia route, in terms of smuggling, and of course, in terms of facilitating and helping us in the hostage deal, which is really the key objective for us right now. But the peace, we shouldn't forget that the peace of Egypt was the cornerstone of the whole process that followed with the peace with our Arab nations around us.
And it has been bent at times very severely, but it has
from
not.
From the beginning, from the onset.
But it has not. But it has not broken.
Exactly.
And there's something to be said for that. Doron Avital, Ariel Osran, thank you for joining us this evening on The Rundown. We are going to turn now to Europe, where 5 people, including a minor, are being held in custody under suspicion of planning 3 terror attacks during the Paris Olympics and Paralympics. Now, France has been on its high security alert in the months ahead of the international athletic competitions, which wrapped up last week. Lynn Plachmeyer has more on that in this report.
French authorities foiled 3 plots to attack the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Paris and other cities that hosted the Summer Games, which were held against the backdrop of the Israel-Hamas war, according to information that's come to light.
We understand today that 3 terrorist attacks have been thwarted during this period of the Olympics. A terrorist attack against establishments such as bars located around the Geoffrey Guichard Stadium have been thwarted. Another group had planned attacks against Israeli institutions, Israel representatives in Paris, and lastly, 2 people from the Gironde region had planned an attack during the Paris Games.
The suspects involved in the terror plots are currently in custody.
All those who had planned terrorist attacks have been arrested. 5 people, including an under 18, were given preliminary charges and are in prison right now.
The threats of terror attacks have risen significantly ever since Hamas's brutal assault on southern Israel on October 7, and Israel decided to engage in a counteroffensive against the terror group in Gaza. Only last week, a suspect opened fire near the Israeli consulate in Munich, after which he was killed by the police. Furthermore, a report stated that European intelligence agencies recently thwarted Iranian plots on Jewish institutions in France and Germany. Not only Europe is facing threats from Muslim extremists. North America is also on edge, ever since a 20-year-old Pakistani male was arrested in Canada this week for plotting the mass slaughter of Jews at a Jewish community center in Brooklyn on October 7. And so, with the first anniversary of the Dark Sabbath fast approaching, the Western world is on high alert for any potential threat.
Now let's take a break from all this security news and end the broadcast on a story that maybe is a little smaller, but has a nice, happy ending. 2 weeks after a rare Bronze-era jar, that's something over 3,000 years ago, was accidentally smashed into pieces by a 4-year-old boy visiting a museum in Israel. That's a story we covered here on I-24 News. That antique jar was back on display after restoration experts were able to carefully piece it back together. The story and the museum's unlikely reaction to this unfortunate incident garnered international attention, warming the hearts of people around the world. Jody Notelevitz brings us up to date.
"Please let that not be my child," are the words that raced through Alex Geller's head when he heard a crash while visiting the Hecht Museum in Haifa last month with his 3 sons. A rare Bronze-era jar was tipped over by Geller's 4-year-old son, smashing it. The jar had been on display for 35 years and was one of the only containers of its size from that period still complete when it was discovered. Inbal Rivlin, the museum's director, chose to turn the incident into a teaching moment, inviting the Geller family back for a special visit and to take part in the restoration process. In so doing, she captured international attention.
In the situation here in Israel, there is a very difficult times for us, and the people are very stressful. And to see such act that is different, that you take the incidents and you treat it. You don't ignore it, you don't shout, you don't want to give fines, not to the family and not to the kid. Well, he's just a kid. So I think that somehow it touches the heart of the people in Israel and around the world.
And on Wednesday, the jar was back on display after being restored by a team of experts using 3D technology, high-resolution videos, and special glue. Roe Shafir, who reassembled the jar, said despite the accident, artifacts should remain accessible to the public because touching an artifact can inspire a deeper interest in history and archaeology. A guide at the museum agrees.
We think that you have to teach the audience, and of course the young audience, our young visitors, how to visit the museum, how to behave in a museum. This is an educational experience. People often ask me, what's the youngest age you would recommend people coming to the museum? And I say, there's no minimum age.
The restoration process has left small hairline cracks, and a few pieces are missing. But the only noticeable difference in the exhibit was a new sign reading, "Please don't touch."
Well, I have to agree with that. Of course, I did notice that the jar was behind the glass case now, and maybe that's where you want to keep things, objects that could be pretty easily broken, that have some priceless value there. But anyway, it's nice. That young boy will hopefully be going to many more museums in his life. Thank you for joining us on The Rundown on I-24 News. You can continue to follow us on our website, of course, on our social media platforms, and if you can, catch The Rundown.